Imagine coming home one night and finding the person you love most lying lifeless on the garage floor. Imagine the terror, the confusion, and the horror of realizing the killer might be someone you know. But what if the killer wasn't just close? What if it was you? This is the haunting story of Randy Trimble, a young woman murdered in cold blood, and the secret plot buried beneath friendship, horror movies, and betrayal. Stay till the end, because what you're about to hear is darker than fiction. Don't look away. Imagine this: a cold January night in Pennsylvania, a small suburban home. Lights off, silence so deep you can almost hear the walls breathe. Inside, a woman lies dead on the garage floor, blood soaking through her clothes, a strand of Christmas lights wrapped cruelly around her neck. The perfect family life gone. The truth? Even darker than anyone dared to imagine. This is the story of Randy Trimble. And the night, everything she built was destroyed. A life built on hope. Randy wasn't famous. She wasn't wealthy. She was something rarer, quietly good. Born December 15th, 1974 in Virginia, she was her mother's only child. Her father left early. It was just the two of them. Her mom worked multiple jobs, cleaning offices at dawn, waiting tables at night to keep food on the table. And Randy? She grew up watching sacrifice firsthand, but she never let the weight of it dull her spirit. Music, laughter, and a plan. In high school, Randy found her escape in the arts. She played flute in the school band, sang in choir, acted in plays. Teachers remembered her as the kid who always stayed after to help put away chairs. Never the loudest in the room, but the most determined. She carried that same drive to Bloomsburg University in Pennsylvania. While other students partied, Randy studied late into the night. She wanted to be a speech therapist to help children find their voices. And she did it, even earned a scholarship for her graduate program, lifting the crushing weight of tuition from her mother's shoulders. A love story that felt unbreakable. While at college, she met Brian. Quiet, bookish, worked in IT. They clicked over small things, favorite movies, late-night coffee runs. The way both felt a little out of place at loud parties. To friends, they seemed inseparable. When Randy walked into a room, Brian's eyes always found her first. They dated through college, graduated, got engaged, but life, as always, had other plans. The diagnosis that changed everything. Just before their wedding, Brian was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, a cruel, unpredictable disease. For some, it moves slowly. For others, it strikes hard, stealing strength, speech, and independence. Brian was only in his 20s. Doctors couldn't predict what would happen, only that it would. Randy didn't hesitate. She married him anyway. We'll figure it out, she told friends. Together, building their future. After the wedding, they moved to Camp Hill, a small town with tree-lined streets and neighbors who waved from porches. Randy landed a steady job at a medical center. Brian got hired in the IT department of an insurance company. They bought a modest house, painted the walls themselves, argued over curtain colors, talked about starting a family. Someday, when the time felt right, they saved. Randy even took a second job, determined to build a cushion in case Brian's health declined faster than expected. To outsiders, it looked like a normal, happy marriage. Inside, cracks began to form. Money, worry, and silent resentment. Randy was always planning, saving, worrying about the what-ifs. What if Brian needed full-time care? What if medical bills piled up? What if she had to do it alone? Brian hated those conversations. He didn't want to think of himself as a burden. He wanted to live, to spend, to forget, at least for a little while, that there was a clock ticking inside his body. January 10th, 2003, the last ordinary morning. That Friday started like countless others. Coffee brewing before dawn. Randy gathering her bag, coat, and a small lunch she'd packed the night before. She left for work, smiled at the receptionist, laughed with a co-worker about a patient's drawing, made plans to grab dinner with Brian that weekend. By late afternoon, she clocked out but didn't go home. She headed to her second job as usual. A small sacrifice, she thought, for a safer future. Brian's evening plans. Brian also left work early. He drove about an hour away to meet a friend at a cafe in another town. They talked about video games, about movies, about everything and nothing. By all accounts, Brian seemed normal. No sign that his life was about to change forever. An empty house. At 9 p.m., Brian returned home. Snow crunched under his tires. The porch light, normally on, was dark. Inside, the house felt wrong. He called out, "Randy?" No answer. The discovery. Room by room, Brian searched. The living room, couch cushions on the floor, drawers open. The kitchen, a chair tipped over, a few things missing. And then the garage. The door creaked open. Cold air rushed in. On the concrete floor, Brian saw her. Randy, face pale, eyes closed, blood pooled beneath her. A strand of Christmas lights wrapped around her neck. Panic, grief, and a call for help. Brian froze. A sound rose from his throat, part scream, part sob. He fumbled for his phone. "My wife, there's blood?" Paramedics arrived within minutes. They checked Randy for signs of life. One shook his head. "I'm sorry." Just like that, Randy Trimble, daughter, wife, speech therapist, dreamer, was gone. Detectives arrive. Police sealed off the garage. Flashlights swept over bloodstains, footprints, scattered papers. No forced entry. No murder weapon. Missing cash, jewelry, Randy's engagement ring. A detective whispered to another. 27 stab wounds. This wasn't just robbery. The start of questions. Brian told them about his evening. An hour away, with a friend, at the cafe. Detectives took notes, but suspicion lingered. They always start with the spouse. The medical examiner's report. Stabbed 27 times. Someone also tried, but failed to strangle her. She fought back. Bruises on her arms. Defensive wounds. But there were no signs of sexual assault. A family in shock. Randy's mother arrived, shaking, tears freezing on her cheeks. "Who could do this?" she whispered. Neighbors gathered outside, whispering behind gloved hands. Such a sweet couple. They never fought, did they? Brian's alibi holds up. Detectives checked. Receipts matched the time. Staff and customers at the cafe remembered seeing him. Impossible, they concluded, for Brian to have driven home, committed murder, and gone back. But something still didn't sit right. A killer on the loose. Camp Hill slept uneasily that night. Doors were double-locked. Porch lights stayed on. Because somewhere out there, someone had killed Randy Trimble. And no one, not even the detectives, yet knew why. The question that would haunt them all. Why would anyone want Randy dead? What was missing from this picture-perfect marriage? The answer was coming, and it would shock everyone. Imagine this. A husband in tears. A house ripped apart. A young wife lying dead in the cold garage. But detectives knew better than to stop at the surface. They always do. And when they started digging, the story of Randy and Brian, once picture-perfect, began to crumble. The days after. Funeral flowers wilt faster in winter. Within days, Randy's casket was lowered into frozen earth. Friends stood silent, breath steaming in the cold. Brian, pale and shaky, stood at the graveside. Some whispered that grief had taken everything out of him. Others whispered different things. Questions, doubts, because grief, as raw as it feels, isn't always proof of innocence. Detectives take a closer look. Back at the station, detectives studied photos of the crime scene. The Christmas lights around Randy's neck. The stab wounds. The unlocked window. 27 stab wounds. One detective murmured, "That's rage, not just a robbery." They circled Randy's name on the whiteboard. Drew an arrow to Brian's. Step 1 in every murder. Look at the spouse. The alibi. Brian said he'd been an hour away that evening. Met a friend at a cafe. The friend confirmed it. So did the cafe staff. Receipts matched. Security cameras caught Brian sitting there at the table, nursing a coffee. It seemed airtight, but airtight doesn't always mean clean. Something felt wrong. Detectives replayed Brian's 911 call. Listened to every shaky breath. He sounded frantic, but there was something too calm, almost rehearsed in places, and when detectives asked him later exactly how he'd found Randy, Brian's story began to shift. The marriage no one knew. On paper, Randy and Brian were the definition of solid. College sweethearts. Bought a home. Built savings. But when detectives visited Randy's workplace, her friends painted a more complicated picture. She worried a lot, said one coworker, especially about money. Brian wanted to spend. Randy wanted to save. She worked 2 jobs, said another. Brian resented that. He felt like she didn't trust him. Small cracks, but cracks all the same. Money troubles in the shadows. Randy had been stockpiling money, a savings fund, just in case Brian's MS got worse. Brian didn't see it as caution. He saw it as control. He told a coworker once, offhand, "I feel like she makes every decision. It's like living in a cage." Brian's purchases after her death. Less than a month after Randy's funeral, Brian started spending. New TV, expensive gaming system, brand new living room set. Detectives raised their eyebrows. "Where's the money coming from?" they asked. Brian said insurance payouts. One for the stolen jewelry. Another, the life insurance policy Randy had. "Grieving can get expensive," he told a friend, half joking. But detectives didn't laugh. A move and a distance. Brian also moved out of their home. Closer to family, he said. He stopped going to work some days. And he cut off Randy's mother, the woman who had been like a second mother to him. The same mother-in-law who, just weeks earlier, had called him the best thing that ever happened to Randy. The change felt too sharp, too sudden. The coworker named Blaine. Then detectives heard another name, Blaine. Blaine and Brian worked together in IT. Bonded over video games, horror movies. They were tight, a coworker recalled. Always whispering about some project. That project turned out to be a low-budget horror film. Blaine dreamed of directing. Brian offered to help. The horror film obsession. The film's plot was dark. A group of hikers stumble on an abandoned mining town and awaken an evil spirit. But it was the real-life plan behind it that caught detectives' attention. Blaine had been desperate for money to fund production, more than $10,000. Brian had promised to pitch in, even talked about dipping into the savings he and Randy had built. Randy refused. It's too risky, she'd argued. And Blaine? He was furious. Brian's story changes again. Detectives asked Brian to walk them through the crime scene again. This time his words wavered. At first, Brian had sworn he never touched Randy's body. Now he said he held her hand, pulled her into his arms. Small detail? Maybe. But to detectives it was a sign. Someone carrying a heavy secret. A new strategy. They kept calling Brian, checking small details, asking the same questions in new ways. Each call made Brian sweat a little more. They wanted him off balance, afraid. And it worked. The breakthrough, interview. Early May, nearly 5 months after Randy's murder. Detectives brought Brian in for what he thought was another routine talk. But this time, they laid everything on the table. Your spending, your lies, the divorce talk, Blaine, the movie, the alibi. Then one detective leaned in. "We know you didn't kill Randy," he said quietly. "But we also know you know who did." The silence before the storm. Brian sat frozen. Then he asked his mother, who had come to support him, to leave the room. When the door clicked shut, the words spilled out. "I'll tell you everything," he whispered, "but no death penalty." Detectives agreed. Brian's confession. He told them about the growing resentment, about Randy's refusal to fund the movie, and about Blaine. "We thought the only way," Brian said, voice cracking, "was to get rid of her." It wasn't just money. It was anger, bitterness, the feeling of being trapped. Brian told detectives how they plotted for months. "We'd make it look like a robbery," he confessed, then use the insurance payout to finish the movie. The plan. On the day of the murder, Brian left work early, met a friend in another town, his alibi. Blaine stayed behind, hidden in the house. When Randy came home, Blaine attacked. At first tried to strangle her, but Randy fought back. Then came the knife. 27 times. Brian returned home later. Saw the blood. Called 911. Played the grieving husband. Detectives react. Detectives were stunned and sickened. A husband, planning his wife's murder. All for a film project, and to feel free again. I thought I was sparing her the pain of divorce, Brian added. Cold comfort, they thought. But the case wasn't over. Now detectives needed Blaine. And Brian's word alone wouldn't convict him. They needed evidence, receipts, witnesses, anything. So they turned their focus to the man who had been, until now, just a whisper in the background. The horror beneath the surface. The story that had started as a burglary gone wrong had twisted into something darker. Two friends, a horror movie script, a wife who stood in the way, and detectives were about to find out. Blaine's secrets were even darker than Brian's. At first, Blaine looked harmless, quiet, nerdy, a man obsessed with horror movies, scripts, and special effects. But detectives knew monsters don't always look like monsters. And as they started digging into Blaine, the picture changed. Fast, the friend who stayed silent. For months, Blaine had barely appeared in the investigation. Brian had been the obvious suspect, the husband, the one with motive. But now, Brian had named him as the killer. Detectives needed proof. And Blaine? He had no idea the walls were closing in. A script turns into a blueprint. They started by rereading Blaine's horror script. At first glance, it was just fiction. Hikers, spirits, a mining town. But hidden in the margins were scribbles, scenes of violence, notes about strangling, and next to one line, two chilling words. Real fear. Detectives wondered, was the script just a story? Or a rehearsal? The shopping list. Detectives got a warrant for Blaine's bank records. Then they checked his credit card. On the day Randy died, Blaine had gone shopping. Nothing unusual until they saw what he bought. Black hoodie, black pants, work gloves, rubber gloves. Then, most damning of all, a large hunting knife. It looked less like a horror fan's props and more like a killer's kit. Following the trail, detectives visited the store. Security cameras showed Blaine at the checkout. Calm, casual, as if he were buying milk, not murder weapons. The receipt matched the timeline, just hours before Randy's murder. Searching Blaine's car. Next, they searched Blaine's car. Inside, on the passenger seat, a crumpled receipt. Same store, same day, same items. Detectives stared at it in silence. He kept it, one whispered, maybe as a trophy. Or maybe he thought no one would ever look. Blaine's alibi. Blaine had an alibi. Two friends swore they'd seen him at his apartment at 7:30 p.m. Detectives checked the timeline. Randy died around that time. If Blaine was really at home, he couldn't have killed her. But something fell off. The gas station receipt. The friends mentioned they stopped at a gas station after leaving Blaine's. Detectives pulled the receipt. The timestamp read 8:30 p.m., not 7:30. That meant Blaine could have left the crime scene, driven home, and still been there in time for his friends to see him. The alibi cracked. The medical examiner. Detectives brought the same model knife Blaine had bought to the medical examiner. He compared it to Randy's wounds. The blade matched perfectly. Proof Blaine's knife could have been the murder weapon. Closing in, detectives didn't confront Blaine immediately. Instead, they watched him. Outside his apartment. At work. In parking lots. They wanted him to feel the heat. They also tapped his phone. Blaine starts to panic. At first, Blaine acted normal. Showed up to work. Drank coffee. Talked about horror movies. Then, slowly, he started to change. He spoke less. Looked over his shoulder. Left work early. Fear had set in. The arrest. When detectives finally knocked on his door, Blaine opened it, pale. They told him he was under arrest for murder. He didn't speak. Didn't argue. Instead, Blaine fainted. Collapsed on the floor, like a man whose nightmare had just caught up to him. Inside the interrogation room. When Blaine came to, detectives laid out the evidence. The shopping receipts. The matching knife. Brian's confession. The false alibi. We know, they said softly, that you killed Randy. Blaine denies everything. Blaine shook his head. I didn't do it, he whispered, again and again. It wasn't me. The death penalty looms. Prosecutors announced they'd pursue the death penalty. Suddenly, Blaine's denial cracked. His lawyer reached out. Blaine wanted to talk. The plea deal. In exchange for taking death off the table, Blaine agreed to confess. In court, voice shaking, he admitted what happened. I waited in the house, he said. I thought it would be quick. She fought back. So I stabbed her. Again and again. He said he expected to get $20,000 from Randy's life insurance. To pay my debts, he said. The horror of the truth. In the gallery, Randy's mother wept. Two men, one her son-in-law, the other his friend, had plotted to kill her daughter. All for money. And a low-budget horror film. Brian's fate. Brian had confessed too. He told the court he felt trapped by Randy's control over money. I thought death would be kinder than divorce, he said, a sentence that made the courtroom gasp. The sentence is, both men were sentenced to life in prison. No parole. No second chance. The courtroom fell silent as the judge read the sentence. Aftermath. Randy's mother didn't stop at grief. She started a nonprofit, a small group to help victims of domestic violence. If it saves even one woman, she said, then Randy's death won't be in vain. To this day, the group still helps hundreds each year. A story that stays with you. Detectives who worked the case still talk about it. Two ordinary men, no criminal record, turned into killers, all because of bitterness, debt, and a dream that turned toxic, a final reflection. In the end, Randy never got to see the film they thought would make them rich. It was never finished, but the story of her murder became a cautionary tale, a true horror story. The courthouse was packed. Reporters, locals, even people who had never met Randy came to watch. Everyone wanted to see. What kind of men could plan something so cold? What would they say for themselves? And when Brian and Blaine finally faced justice, what came out was even darker than anyone expected. The opening gambit. From the first minute, prosecutors painted the picture. Two men, one motive, money. They called it a murder-for-profit plot. But it wasn't just greed, they said. It was pride, frustration, a fantasy of success built on a woman's blood. Blaine, the would-be filmmaker. Blaine sat at the defense table, shoulders hunched. Once, he dreamed of being a horror director. Now, the courtroom was staring at him as the real villain. His lawyer tried to soften the image. My client was desperate, in debt, pressured by Brian. But it fell flat, because in Blaine's own confession, the details were chilling. Too detailed, too practiced. Brian, the husband. Then there was Brian, the grieving widower, or so everyone had thought. He looked thin, pale, eyes sunken for months in jail. But when the prosecutor described how he had betrayed his wife, even some jurors turned away. Instead of asking for help, the prosecutor thundered, he asked for murder. The emails and texts. Detectives had pulled months of emails and chat logs between the two men. In court, they read them aloud. We can do this. Blaine had written, once she's gone, you'll have the money. I know, Brian had replied. We just need to make sure it looks random. The words echoed in the silent room. Planned, calculated, cold, the crime scene photos. Then came the hardest part. Prosecutors showed photos of the garage. Randy's body, the blood, the Christmas lights twisted around her neck. Some jurors covered their mouths. One woman in the gallery wept. And Blaine? He didn't look up once. The motive unmasked. Prosecutors laid it out. Brian was tired of living under Randy's careful budgeting. He resented feeling controlled. Blaine saw a chance to fix his crushing debt and fund his horror movie. Together, they planned to stage a burglary, kill Randy, cash in on insurance and savings. Simple, brutal, final. The friend who turned. Brian's confession became the centerpiece. He told the court how they brainstormed the plan, how to create an alibi, what time Randy would be home, even how to stage the mess in the house. He confessed because prosecutors promised to drop the death penalty, but his voice was strangely calm. I wanted her gone, he said. I thought it was the only way out. Blaine's defense. Blaine's lawyers tried to push blame back onto Brian. They said Blaine was manipulated, that he was weak, not evil. He was a man drowning in debt, they argued. He got pulled into something he didn't fully understand. But prosecutors fired back. He was the one holding the knife. The forensics, a knife bought by Blaine, matched the wounds. Rubber gloves bought the same day. Traced to Blaine. Friends tried to give Blaine an alibi, but the gas station receipt destroyed the timeline. Piece by piece, the puzzle came together. Brian's spending spree. Jurors heard how, after Randy died, Brian bought a big TV, an Xbox, expensive furniture. Grieving can get expensive, Brian had joked to a friend. In court, no one laughed. The shock in the gallery. Randy's mother sat quietly through every testimony. When Brian described planning the murder, she bowed her head. When Blaine explained how Randy had fought back, tears streamed down her face. To her, they weren't characters in a courtroom drama. They were real. They had killed her only child. Closing arguments. In final statements, the prosecutor's voice shook. This was a woman who did everything right. Worked 2 jobs. Loved her husband. And how was she repaid? With betrayal so deep, it still echoes in this room. Brian's lawyer asked for mercy, citing his illness. Blaine's lawyer asked for leniency, blaming desperation. But mercy felt far away. The verdict. The jury deliberated. Not for days, just hours. They returned. Guilty of first-degree murder for Blaine. Guilty of first-degree murder for Brian. No chance of parole. Life in prison. In that moment, 2 futures ended. The sentencing. Before the judge spoke, Randy's mother addressed the court. You didn't just take my daughter, she said. You took every Christmas, every birthday, every grandchild I'll never hold. Her voice cracked, but she finished, I hope you never know another day of freedom. The judge's words were final. Life in prison, without parole. Neither man looked surprised. After the trial, reporters asked, why? Why would 2 men with steady jobs, no criminal past, do something so horrific? Detectives believe it was a toxic mix. Blaine's obsession with finishing his film, Brian's resentment and fear of being trapped by Randy's plans, and the fantasy that money would fix everything. A fantasy that cost a woman her life. The film that was never finished. Blaine's horror movie never saw daylight. The raw footage sits forgotten. No edits. No premiere. Detectives say it's chilling to watch, because the story on screen is fiction. But what Blaine did, that was real horror. The lesson that lingers. To this day, those close to Randy say her story is a warning. Love can blind us to danger. Obsession can turn ordinary people into killers. And sometimes monsters wear familiar faces. A final tribute. In the courthouse lobby, there's a plaque with Randy's name. Not as a victim, but as a reminder. She lived with kindness. She died by betrayal. May her memory guide us to protect others. After the trial ended, silence filled the courtroom. The crowds left. The cameras packed up. And the town of Camp Hill tried to go back to normal. But for Randy's family and for everyone who followed the case, life would never be the same. Because murder doesn't end with a verdict. It echoes in empty rooms, in broken traditions, in questions that never get answered. The empty house. Randy's mother, Janice, couldn't bring herself to step inside the house at first. Too many memories. Photos still on the wall. Randy's shoes by the door. The kitchen calendar still showed January 2003, the month her daughter died. But eventually, Janice forced herself in. Room by room. In the bedroom, Randy's clothes still hung neatly. Folded sweaters. A scarf she wore every winter. In the garage, the stains had been cleaned, but the horror remained. No amount of bleach could erase what happened there. Brian's shadow. Brian had been like a son to Janice. She'd trusted him. Welcomed him into family dinners. Called him when Randy worked late just to check in. After the murder, that trust twisted into something darker. She couldn't stop replaying moments. Brian's voice on the phone. His nervous hugs at the funeral. How he'd looked away when people mentioned Randy's future. All signs she missed or wanted to miss. Questions that haunt. Why didn't he just divorce Randy? Why plan her death? Some nights, Janice sat awake, asking the empty room. Was there a moment she realized who was behind it? Did she know it was Brian? No one could answer. That question, sharp as broken glass, never dulled, turning grief into purpose. One morning, after weeks of numbness, Janice opened Randy's closet. She pulled out a box Randy kept. Old cards, letters, notes from patients she'd helped as a speech therapist. Children who could finally say Mom or Dad because of Randy's work. Reading those notes, Janice felt something stir. Randy had spent her life helping others. Maybe that could continue, even now. The birth of a nonprofit. In 2004, Janice founded a small nonprofit. Its mission, to support victims of domestic violence and their families. At first, it was nothing more than flyers, meetings in church basements, and late-night calls from women afraid to go home. But word spread. Donations trickled in. Volunteers joined. And slowly, something hopeful grew from tragedy. Helping others leave, Janice knew what it felt like to trust the wrong person. Through the nonprofit, she met women living with fear every day. Some needed bus tickets to flee. Others needed emergency hotel rooms. One woman showed up with nothing but her toddler and a diaper bag. Janice saw her own daughter's strength reflected in those women, and their determination to survive. Keeping Randy's name alive, every fundraiser bore Randy's name. Every Christmas, volunteers collected gifts for kids in shelters in Randy's honor. And every year, on the anniversary of her death, Janice lit a candle, not just for the life Randy lost, but for the lives saved because of her. The town remembers. Camp Hill couldn't forget the murder. For months after the trial, people locked their doors earlier. Neighbors eyed each other with quiet suspicion. At the local coffee shop, Randy's photo hung on the wall, a reminder that evil sometimes hides behind familiar faces. But slowly the town healed, scar tissue over an old wound. Brian and Blaine behind bars. In prison, Brian and Blaine were kept apart. Brian, once quiet and polite, became withdrawn. Other inmates avoided him. Word spreads fast behind concrete walls. The man who killed his own wife. Blaine, meanwhile, still talked about making movies. One guard overheard him say, "If we'd done it smarter, we'd be free." Even in prison, some lessons aren't learned. The film that never was. The horror film Blaine dreamed of never got finished. The footage remains stored on an old hard drive, gathering dust. Prosecutors once viewed parts of it. Shaky shots of forest trails. Actors pretending to be terrified. The fictional horror Blaine obsessed over. But in real life, he'd become what he wanted to film. A killer in the dark. Legacy of control. Looking back, friends remember Randy as careful. She tracked spending, saved for emergencies, planned for Brian's illness. To some, it felt controlling. But to her, it was love. A way to protect the life they built. Ironically, that love became the motive that ended her life. Brian didn't want to live under her plans. So he erased her. What about regret? Did Brian ever regret it? In court, he spoke softly. "I wish it hadn't come to this." But he never cried, never apologized to Janice, never said her daughter's name. Maybe guilt lived in him. Or maybe the only thing he regretted was getting caught. Blaine's final words. Before sentencing, Blaine stood. He said, "I didn't mean for it to go that far." But the jury had seen the photos. He'd stabbed Randy 27 times. Words couldn't soften that truth. The ripples. Randy's death changed lives beyond family. Friends stopped trusting easily. Coworkers questioned if they'd miss signs. Even local police updated how they handle domestic cases, looking deeper when someone seems fine. One murder, 1,000 consequences. Hope after horror. Janice's nonprofit grew. Years later, they helped open a shelter, Randy's house, a safe place for women and children escaping abuse. Inside, a small plaque reads, "In memory of Randy Trimble, whose love saves lives still." The world moves on. News cycles moved on. Bigger crimes. New scandals. But for Janice, every day still starts and ends with her daughter's memory. In quiet moments, she wonders what Randy's life might have been. Would she have become a mother? Would she have changed even more lives as a therapist? Would she have finally convinced Brian to see hope instead of fear? Questions without answers. The candle that burns. Every January 10th, Janice lights a single candle. She speaks aloud in the empty room. You mattered. You still matter. And for a moment, the silence feels less heavy. A call to remember. If you're watching this video, remember Randy not just for how she died, but how she lived. Kind, driven, brave enough to love someone even when life got hard. And if you see signs of control, fear, or violence in someone's life, speak up. One voice can make the difference Randy never got. When the cameras shut off, the crowds went home, and the courtroom lights dimmed, only the truth remained. 2 men, 1 woman's life stolen, and a haunting question. How does love become murder? The illusion of devotion. From the outside, Brian and Randy looked like the picture of devotion. A young couple married early, fighting illness together, saving for a future. Neighbors described them as quiet, polite. Friends saw them as inseparable. But behind the shared smiles and polite dinners, something darker was growing. The slow poison of resentment. It didn't happen overnight. It began with small annoyances, arguments over bills, Brian feeling trapped, Randy trying to plan every detail of life. Then annoyance became bitterness. Bitterness turned to resentment, and resentment left unchecked can curdle into hate. Blaine, the catalyst. Enter Blaine. He wasn't just a friend. He was an accelerant. Blaine fed Brian's frustration, offered a way out that sounded almost logical in Brian's twisted thinking. And together, they convinced each other it was possible. 2 men who loved horror stories, now writing one into real life. A plan written in blood. In their movie scripts, evil is thrilling. In life, it's messier. Brian and Blaine thought they could design the perfect murder. Stage a robbery. Secure alibis. Collect insurance. Simple on paper. But real life doesn't follow a script. Randy's final moments. Imagine Randy that night, coming home tired, dreaming of a shower, dinner, maybe a call with her mom. And instead, betrayal waiting in the dark. A man she barely knew, sent by the man she loved. She fought back. Fought harder than Blaine expected. Because life, even when surprised by horror, clings to hope. But the plan didn't need her hope. Only her death. The horror beyond the crime. Some crimes end when the act is over. This one didn't. Brian returned home, stepped over the destruction he'd helped create, called 911 with practice panic, told the world, "My wife, someone killed her." And for weeks, he almost got away with it. The masks we wear. People said Brian was a good man. Quiet, kind, sick, but brave. They saw the mask. But masks slip. His spending spree. His lies. The way he distanced himself from Randy's grieving mother. Truth seeps through even the best disguise. Blaine's dream, twisted. Blaine once dreamed of making a horror movie that would scare audiences. Instead, he made real horror. No soundtrack. No credits. Only a grieving family, a ruined town, and a future destroyed. And in the end, no fame. Only a prison cell. Why didn't they stop? One of the hardest questions to answer. They could have stopped. Brian could have filed for divorce. Blaine could have walked away. But once the idea took root, it grew. They told themselves it was about money, about freedom. But at the core, it was about control. Taking a life, to take back power they felt they'd lost. What remains in the aftermath? For Randy's mother, the murder wasn't the end of pain. Every birthday, every holiday, every random Tuesday that feels heavy without reason. She says the world feels off balance, like part of its axis is missing, the nonprofit that saves lives. But grief became action. Randy's house doesn't just honor a victim, it shelters the living. Dozens of women and children have found refuge there. Each story different, but each rooted in the same fear Randy likely felt. And Janice sees her daughter's spirit in every woman who dares to leave an abusive home. Lessons in betrayal. This case teaches us betrayal doesn't always come from strangers. Sometimes it wears the face you love most. Brian loved Randy once, Blaine called Brian his best friend. Yet, love twisted by fear, resentment, or greed can become deadly. The public memory. For a while, Randy's story was on every local news broadcast. Reporters stood outside the courthouse, repeating her name. But news cycles move on. What remains isn't the headlines, but the echoes. Friends still double-checking locked doors. A mother lighting a candle every January. A small town remembering a kindness stolen. Justice? Both Brian and Blaine received life sentences without parole. But is that justice? No sentence restores a life. Justice, at best, prevents them from harming anyone else. But it doesn't undo what's done. Brian's silence. To this day, Brian has never truly explained why. Not beyond money, stress, or vague talk about feeling trapped. He has never apologized to Janice. Never stood in court and said, "I am sorry." Maybe he can't. Maybe he won't. Some truths remain buried even deeper than a victim. Blaine's regret or performance. Before the plea deal, Blaine cried in court. He said, "I didn't want to hurt her that bad." But prosecutors pointed out 27 stab wounds, rubber gloves, a knife bought days earlier. Regret after capture feels different than remorse. The larger story. This isn't just about one murder. It's about what happens when resentment meets opportunity. About how unchecked anger finds an accomplice. And how horror fiction became real blood on real floors. The memory that endures. In every case like this, there's a victim who deserves to be remembered for life, not death. Randy wasn't just a woman murdered by her husband. She was a daughter who called her mom every night. A speech therapist who helped kids find their first words. A woman who dreamed of a family despite hardship. That's the real story. A call to action. If you see signs of control, isolation, or escalating anger, don't look away. Speak. Call. Check in. Randy might have survived if someone had seen the danger earlier. Your voice could save someone else. Final reflections. As this story ends, ask yourself, what masks do people wear around you? Do you know what secrets they hide? And most important, do you truly listen when someone says they're afraid? One last candle. Every year, Janice lights that candle for Randy. It flickers in the dark, a small, stubborn light. Maybe that's what memory is. Not enough to erase loss, but enough to keep hope alive. And as long as that flame burns, Randy's story isn't over. If this story moved you, please share it. Tell someone. Light your own candle. And if you see someone living in fear, help them leave before love turns fatal.